Welcome to 20th Century Arts. We are continuing our series on why Black Sabbath is the most important rock band. In this episode, we are going to see a band go through an identity crisis and get reborn. We're also going to look at the bands and music scenes that were inspired by Sabbath in the mid to late 70s. The band decided on a change of scene for the recording of the next album and ended up in sunny Miami at the Criteria Studios in June 1976. The sunny environment made the members want to enjoy themselves, but Iommi felt he could not enjoy the beach because no one wanted to bring in an outside producer, so Iommi felt it was up to him to do the job. Iommi was also feeling that the band needed to go in a new direction if they wanted to stay relevant. There were major changes happening in the music industry. Yes, the punk revolution was starting in the UK, but its impact would not really be felt until the next year. But the industry was beginning to commercialize, and with bigger corporate investments, artists were having a lot of pressure on them to have hits. You gotta remember, 1976 was the year that the live album Frampton Comes Alive did huge numbers and made such a huge profit that Wall Street wanted to get more part of the action in terms of the music business. There were also hits like Boston's More Than a Feeling, and there was a rise in bands like the Electric Light Orchestra, who was actually also managed by Don Arden, and they were getting a bigger push than Sabbath was. Other bands like Chicago and Fleetwood Mac that really showed rock's softer side, a kind of soft album-oriented rock. There was in fact one hard rock heavy metal band that knew how to commercialize the dark imagery that Sabbath had flirted with, and that was Kiss. And then of course there was the Eagles, who played a soft country-infused rock, who were actually recording their soon-to-be massive album, Hotel California, in the studio next door to Sabbath. Apparently, the Eagles had left a ton of cocaine in the mixing board. Iommi felt that he needed Sabbath to conform more to this commercialized epoch of music. And that resulted in the band making a greater departure from their signature heavy riff sound. And the result was Technical Ecstasy, released in 1976. Now, there are many fans of this album, and there's a lot of great songs on the LP, but this is really a long way from their very first album. And this was a conscious decision. As Iommi stated, "Some people may have heard the band in 1970 and be thinking, oh no, not them again, but if they heard us now, they probably might like us." So, the album, it starts out with the rocking and rhythmic Backstreet Kids, a pretty solid song. It includes keyboard parts that would, comfortably fit on a Styx album. The brooding You Won't Change Me is next, which is actually a favorite of comedian Joey Diaz. The song starts out dark, but the keyboards give it some sunshine. Then by the time the chorus kicks in, the band has become the Beatles. Speaking of that, the next track is a full-on Beatle-esque piano-based track song called It's Alright, and it is actually sung by Bill Ward. Playing this track to people who might have heard the big Sabbath songs would be surprised and probably convinced that this wasn't actually the same band. This song apparently is one of Axl Rose's favorites, and he has played it live many times. Gypsy struts along like a Kiss song and then descends into a kind of Genesis Supertramp sound. After that is the funky sounding All Moving Parts Stand Still, which is followed by the bar boogie sound of Rock and Roll Doctor, which is more in line with Foghat or Status Quo. Then there is the acoustic and orchestral She's Gone. As I said, we are a long way from the first album. The album ends with the mid-tempo rocker Dirty Women. There are some great unique moments on this album, but it does not really sound like Sabbath. And the mix is kind of odd. It seemed like Iommi decided to insert guitar leads in various places just to remind everyone that this album was made by Black Sabbath. The tour for the album lasted from October 22nd, 1976 till April 22nd, 1977. On this tour, many different bands opened for Sabbath, including Ted Nugent and his band, Boston, Bob Seger, Nuts, Journey, and Heart. However, on the last leg of the technical Ecstasy tour, which was made up entirely of European dates, the opening act was AC/DC. This band from Australia played a super heavy, balls-to-the-wall version of traditional rock and roll, and they were climbing the mountain to success. The band's live shows were tight, stripped down, and outright vicious. Sabbath were confused musically, and most of the band was continuing their descent into substance abuse. AC/DC's rip-roaring performances at time made Sabbath feel like a bunch of has-beens. And on top of that, there were tensions between the two bands. Well, not surprisingly, Bon Scott and Ozzy got on famously. Butler and Angus Young almost got into a fight when Butler pulled out a switchblade comb, which Young thought was real. Then on top of that, Ward's anxiety was increasing. On that tour, he insisted on being driven from gig to gig in a Winnebago whenever possible because he had developed a fear of flying, and things were gonna just become more turbulent for the band. Taking their name from a line in the Bob Dylan song, The Ballad of Frankie Lee and Judas Priest, Judas Priest formed in 1969 and gigged regularly around the UK. By 1974, the band consisted of singer Rob Halford, guitarist Glenn Tippin, guitarist KK Downing, bassist Ian Hill, and drummer John Hitch. They played regularly with bands like Pink Fairies, UFO, and Budgie. Budgie are in fact a Welsh power trio whose heaviness at times actually rivaled Sabbath's. Judas Priest's debut album, Rock-A-Rolla, came out in 1974 and was actually produced by Roger Bain, remember the producer of the first three Sabbath albums. However, the album has sort of more of a blues rock sound, and it didn't really include some of the songs that reflected the sound of the band that they had been developing at the live shows. Halford has an incredible range as a vocalist, and he can hit high notes, as well as Led Zeppelin's Robert Plant, Deep Purple's Ian Gillan, who by that time was no longer a member of Deep Purple, and Queen's Freddie Mercury. Another key sound of Judas Priest was having a twin lead guitar approach, where the two guitarists would play a riff simultaneously to get a thicker sound. This approach had been done by bands like Wishbone Ash and Thin Lizzy, but Priest's approach was to merge this with the heaviness of Sabbath, as well as the sounds of other bands like Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin, and Queen. This sound was realized on their sophomore album, Sad Wings of Destiny, in 1976. Now, if Sabbath by that time had album covers with fighting robots and Beatlesque ballads, Priest had a dark album cover with heavy music to match, with songs like Victim of Changes, The Ripper, Tyrant, and The Island of Domination. Over the next three albums, which were Sin After Sin, released in 1977, Stained Class, released in 1978, and Killing Machine, which was known as Hellbent for Leather in the States, in 1978, the band extracted the blues out of their heavy sound and developed the next phrase of this sound known as heavy metal, a term that was actually being used regularly now. Furthermore, in 1978, Priest ditched the 70s bell-bottoms and the satin shirts and instead put on leather and studs. Heavy metal now had an image. Osbourne, who was further descending into drug and alcohol abuse, decided to leave the band. He wanted to create a solo project called Blizzard of Oz, and even had t-shirts made. He started jamming with members of the band Dirty Tricks. In the meantime, Sabbath brought in former Savory Brown and Fleetwood Mac vocalist Dave Walker as Osbourne's replacement. Walker wrote a lot of lyrics for the band, but unfortunately none of them ended up being used. The Walker lineup actually appeared on the BBC program Look Here, playing Junior's Eyes, a song that would be on their next album. However, Osbourne had a change of heart and decided to come back to the band. But the band was booked to fly over to my home city of Toronto, Canada, to record their next album. Their management was trying to get the band away from the high taxes of the Labour government in the UK, and the band would record the album in the first 5 months of the year. Oh boy, Black Sabbath was not ready for a Canadian winter. The other problem was Ozzy did not want to use any of the lyrics that they wrote with Walker, so they would have to be written now during the recording process. Also, to get a proper sound, they had to rip up the carpeting in the studio. The resulting album, Never Say Die, shows a band, like on Technical Ecstasy, that sounds confused. But there are still a lot of great songs on this LP. The upbeat opening track was a hit for the band and came pretty close to being pop as Sabbath gets. The pace stays upbeat with the keyboard and electric drum beat intro of Johnny Blade, which is a pretty rockin' tune. This track is followed by the excellent and introspective and plotting Junior's Eyes, which now had new lyrics. A solid 70s style rocker, A Hard Road, closes the first side of the album. On side 2, things get a little more disjointed. The melodic Shockwave is first, followed by the mid-tempo Air Dance, which is filled with piano and sounds like the softer moments of King Crimson at times. Another mid-tempo track, Over to You, is next. Then there is the instrumental Breakout, which follows. Breakout is a full-on jazz track, where Sabbath jammed with a brass band. Now, Ozzy thought this concept was dumb, but he was impressed with the drinking abilities of the jazz musicians. The album closes with another mid-tempo rocker, Swinging the Chain, which is another song sung by Ward because Ozzy did not want to do the vocals. The album never really gets to the Sabbath heaviness, but that being said, again, there are quite a few good moments on the album, and I actually quite like it. Kim Thayil, the guitarist of Soundgarden, says that Never Say Die was his favorite Black Sabbath album. Now, the band went on tour from May 2nd until December 11th, 1978. The band were still indulging in excess, and their age was showing. The opening act for most of the tour did not help matters either. Van Halen out of Los Angeles was made up of brothers Eddie and Alex Van Halen on guitar and drums, David Lee Roth on vocals, and Michael Anthony on bass and backing vocals. The band had created a high-energy rock sound that centered around Eddie Van Halen's incredible guitar playing. Eddie used classical guitar techniques like hammer-ons and finger tapping to create these fiery, fast-paced guitar solos that had never really been heard before and would go on to shape rock and metal playing in the 80s and beyond. Their live shows were enhanced by Roth's stage antics, which included jumping high in the air and doing the splits and all kinds of karate kicks. Van Halen's debut album was so fierce and high energy that it has been argued, still to this day, that it is the best debut rock album of all time. To say that Van Halen blew Sabbath off the stage was an understatement. In fact, some of the audiences left after Van Halen's set rather than endure watching a bloated and coked up Ozzy. But the management also put the Ramones, a rising punk band from CBGB scene, as an opening act on some of the date. Now the Ramones, very different. They played the most stripped down form of 3-chord rock and roll with absolutely no guitar solos. Their self-titled debut had been released in 1977, and they had also released Leave Home and Rocket to Russia. They had just finished Road to Ruin, and now did some shows opening for Sabbath, and it was billed as sort of punk versus metal. Oh boy, the rock/metal fans generally hated punk and showed their appreciation for the Ramones with not only booze, but throwing anything at the band, which included beer cans, whiskey bottles, and carburetors. Black Sabbath ended up in LA at the end of the tour. Iommi wanted to get the band focused on the next album, but Ozzy was becoming a complete drunk and was not really interested in songwriting and recording. So Iommi felt that either the band had to break up or Ozzy had to go. Ward, who was going through his own drinking problems, got the honors of firing Ozzy, which happened on April 27, 1979. Ozzy would continue on a downward spiral. He stayed in LA rather than go back to his family in England, as he had become estranged from his wife and 2 kids. Ozzy would go on a 3-month binge in a hotel room, but we will get into his rebirth later on. Ironically, it was Sharon Arden, Don Arden's daughter, that introduced Iommi to the American singer Ronnie James Dio. Ronald James Padavona was born on July 10th, 1942 in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. He grew up in an Italian-American family and developed an appreciation for the Italian-American tenor Mario Lanza. In high school, he began playing in rock and roll bands. His first band, Ronnie and the Redcaps, released 2 singles in 1958. The second of these, An Angel Is Missing, What Did I Have to Say, had Ronnie on vocals. This was crooner music and quite a far cry from his later sound, but one can still hear the power of his voice. An angel is missing from heaven tonight. He began using the stage name Dio, which is God in Italian, instead of his family name. He got the name idea from the gangster Johnny Dio. The band would change their name to Ronnie and the Prophets, and by 1967, the band would become the Electric Elves, which soon became the Elves, and then by 1972, just Elf. The cover of their first album had Dio dressed as an evil-looking elf. Dio was only 5'4", but his voice was absolutely gigantic. Elf found themselves opening up for Deep Purple. When Ritchie Blackmore left Deep Purple and decided to record an album on his own, he did it with 4 members of Elf, including Dio, who he had on vocals. For the tour, he fired everyone, but kept Dio and brought in Cozy Powell on drums. The follow-up album, Rainbow Rising, was a masterpiece. Dio's soaring vocals enhanced the neoclassical guitar playing of Blackmore, especially on the track Stargazer. Dio also brought in sword and sorcery style lyrics, and the band created a sound that kind of gave birth to the genre known as power metal. After the follow-up album, Long Live Rock and Roll, Blackmore decided he wanted to go in a more commercial direction, kind of like AOR thing, thinking Foreigner or Journey, which caused Dio to leave the band. So Dio needed a band, and Iommi needed a singer. Iommi did not choose to succumb to the commercial experiments he had tried on the 2 previous albums. This was because there had been some musical developments back in the UK. When the punk revolution took Britain by storm in 1976 and 77, the Sex Pistols and their ilk had declared war on rock, including heavy rock or heavy metal as it was known. But the metal and rock fans were watching these punks playing 3 chords and calling it music. It was time to fight back. Taking the speed and some of the street look of punk and injecting the power and musicianship of bands like UFO, Thin Lizzy, Judas Priest, Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, and of course, Black Sabbath, they created a fast and heavy metal. Now this style was dubbed the new wave of British heavy metal, and there were bands in the scene like Iron Maiden, Angel Witch, Saxon, Samson, and Tigers of Pantang. And it was really, really intense. Fast riffs, we're talking screaming vocals, and of course, you gotta have guitar solos that were integral to the sound. The one band that they looked to for inspiration in terms of their heaviness was, of course, Black Sabbath. And another factor was a lot of these bands took on the dark imagery that Sabbath had been doing, especially on their first 5 albums. Now, furthermore, metal was now a defined genre with its own subcultures, and the followers had a uniform which included denim jeans and leather jackets, and they took on this identity known as metalheads. What was interesting in this scene was the band Motorhead. They were included in the new wave of British heavy metal scene, but felt just as comfortable in the punk scene. As frontman Lemmy Kilmister stated, "We thought we were punks until they told us our hair was too long." It was in this musical landscape that Iommi was taking inspiration. The band went back to Miami with their new vocalists and recorded from October 1979 to January 1980. It was in the same location where Technical Ecstasy had been recorded. The album was produced by Martin Birch, who had produced Deep Purple, Rainbow, and Whitesnake. The fierce sound of Dio's voice and the influence of Judas Priest and the new wave of British heavy metal brought Sabbath back to their heavy form. The resulting album was Heaven and Hell. The album charges right out the gates with Neon Nights. Dio lays down the fantasy lyrics, circles and rings, dragons and kings. Next up is the epic Children of the Sea with its acoustic intro that soon gets engulfed in heaviness.
We sail across the air before we learn to fly.
This track is followed by the catchy but still heavy Lady Evil. Then there is the absolutely powerful title track, which has become a real crowd pleaser at live shows. This song really highlights how well suited Dio's vocals was with Black Sabbath. The upbeat Wishing Well gets enhanced by the doomy keyboards in the background, which continue into Die Young, a track where the band shows their dynamics again. Then the mid-tempo rocker Walk Away follows. The album closes with the amazing Lonely Is the World, where the band shows off how cohesive a unit they were, combining heaviness with a level of melody that they never really did have with Ozzy. But Ward felt like this was a new band, and he did not know what his role would be in this group. Ward was still struggling with alcoholism and was feeling absolutely miserable. It did not help that Iommi actually lit him on fire. Yes, Iommi poured some tape cleaning fluid on Ward and lit him up. Now, Iommi did not actually realize how flammable the solution was, and Ward ended up with third-degree burns. On top of that, Ward was just generally losing his grip on reality. And on August 19th, 1980, he played his last show and promptly left the tour and the band. Vinny Appice, who had played with Rick Derringer and was the younger brother of Vanilla Fudge drummer Carmine Appice, was brought in as a replacement. During the live shows, Dio started using the devil horn symbol with his hands, which was an old Italian practice, and this became synonymous with heavy metal. Now, the tour had several complications, as always. The first leg of the European tour was fine as new wave of British heavy metal bands like Girl School, as the name suggests, an all-girl band, and Angel Witch were the opening acts. But in North America, there were problems, which also included, of course, Ward's departure. Sandy Pearlman was now the band's new manager, and he was also the founder and manager of the Blue Oyster Cult. The Long Island hard rock band had a commercial success with their 1976 hit Don't Fear the Reaper and their 1977 hit Godzilla, and the band had just released their latest album, Cultosaurus Erectus, in 1980. Pearlman suggested a co-headlining tour, with the two bands alternating being the closing act, and it would be dubbed the Black and Blue Tour. There were tensions over which band would close which shows, and Sabbath was annoyed that the Godzilla stage piece Blue Oyster Cult used took a long time to dismantle. When Ward left, Sabbath were not paid for the shows they missed, and the band felt that Pearlman favored Blue Oyster Cult, and furthermore, they felt that Blue Oyster Cult were copying some of the elements of Sabbath's style. And then there was the Milwaukee show. On October 9th, 1980, while playing Basically, which is the bass intro to NIP, someone threw an object at Geezer Butler, no one's really sure what it was, and it knocked him clean out. Dio yelled at the crowd and told them that the show was canceled. The audience responded by rioting, and it took the police an hour to clear the crowd, but in fact the fighting just continued out into the streets. Butler started seeing beat-up fans arriving at the same hospital he was being treated at. The venue after that decided they would only book artists like Billy Joel or Barry Manilow from now on. No more heavy rock music. A concert film was released of one of the shows from the Black and Blue tour, but Iommi objected to the film, so it's never gotten an official DVD re-release. The band went back to their record plant in Los Angeles, where Volume 4 had been recorded. They worked with Martin Birch again, and Vinny Appice was now the drummer. As usual, there were some tensions within the band. Warner Brothers had actually offered Dio a solo contract as well, which didn't sit well with the other members. But, however, in this situation, the band still did come up with a solid album. The album, titled Mob Rules, opens with the fierce rocker Turn Up the Night. The solid metal track Voodoo is next, followed by the excellent and powerful Sign of the Southern Cross. Then there is the strange instrumental E150, which sounds like something from like a horror sci-fi films, which metamorphosizes into the charging Take No Prisoners title track. The songs on side 2 are kind of in pairs. There's the rocker's The Country Girl that starts side 2, and it's followed by another rocker, Slipping Away. Then there's the brooding and melancholy Falling Off the Edge of the World, and side 2 ends with another brooding and melancholy song over and over. Another version of the song Mob Rules had been recorded at the session, and that was actually ended up on the soundtrack for the Canadian animated film Heavy Metal. The band toured from November 15th, 1981 until August 31st, 1982. The band would release an official live album called Live Evil from 3 shows from the Mob Rules tour. They were in Seattle, Dallas, and San Antonio. There had been an album released of 1973 concerts called Live at Last in 1980 by their former manager, Patrick Meehan, that the band had not approved of. So they wanted their own live album. However, when mixing the live album, there was a massive miscommunication between Dio and Appice on one hand and Iommi and Butler on the other. Appice and Dio were waiting over a few days for Butler and Iommi to come to the studio to begin the mixing process. Dio and Appice passed the time by listening to the recordings. Dio asked the engineer to turn up the vocals. When Iommi showed up, he was completely high on coke. He was told by the engineer that, hey, Dio was listening to the recordings with the vocals turned up, which Iommi thought meant that Dio was actually mixing the album and pushing up the volume on his vocals. This argument created a split between the two factions, and soon Dio and Appice would leave the band. Dio and Appice would go on to record the absolutely fantastic Dio solo album, Holy Diver, which would end up being released in 1983. Meanwhile, Sabbath was without a singer. In the next episode, we're going to see Sabbath go through one of the weirdest identity crises in rock history when another famous singer joins Sabbath. We're also going to see Ozzy re-emerging as a major heavy metal solo artist. And Sabbath, oh, do they give birth to so many offspring. Thank you for watching. If you're watching on YouTube, could you please subscribe, like, share, and comment. If you don't think Sabbath is the most important band in rock history like I do, please leave a comment and tell me why I'm wrong. Thank you.